I wanted to share with you my tips on the easiest way to grow potatoes. Tip number one is all about containers. So we're using 10-gallon containers in the garden, and it's a good size for us. They're easy to fill up and maneuver, especially at the end of the season. One of the important things is to make sure that you've got enough drainage. All of these pots have, I don't know, 4 or 6 drainage holes already in them, but we also drilled more. I think I used a 1/2-inch spade bit when I set the drill on reverse. That way, try to minimize cracking the plastic. And so I drilled, I think, probably 4 to 6 additional holes in the very bottoms of these pots. All right, tip number 2 is all about the soil. So in these pots for our potatoes, we used a 50-50 mix of potting soil and compost. Then we also added an organic balanced fertilizer. We happen to have either plant tone or garden tone from Espoma, and that's what we used. Tip number 3, finally getting to the potatoes. But before planting them out, we start with seed potatoes. And the reason why we start with seed potatoes is these are potatoes that you're getting from a reputable source that you know those potatoes are going to be disease-free. And we can put a link down below in the description for who we get our potatoes from, but you can search online, you can go to your local garden center. When you've got your seed potatoes, one of the things you can do before planting them out is chitting the potatoes. And you chit the potatoes to kind of get them a head start, but put them in a bright spot, bright indirect light, and you'll start to see some of the eyes grow, and that's just trying to give the potatoes a head start before you actually plant them out. Bonus tip, if you've thought about getting potatoes from the grocery store and trying to then grow those, just know that those potatoes might be treated with something that inhibits their ability to then grow roots. So if you try it, just know that they might not grow for you. Tip number 4, now we get to planting. So there's a couple ways you can plant the potatoes in containers. Some potatoes, they're going to grow and produce potatoes really at just one layer, and other potatoes, they will produce kind of all along the stalk. What we did was we put some potatoes down at one layer, piled on some soil, and made a second layer of potatoes and put soil on top of that, since we've got enough room in these pots to do that. Then for the potatoes that produce kind of all the way up, we only put them in the bottom third of the pot and then fill the pot with soil from there. If you're wondering how many potatoes you can put in a pot, that's going to depend on the size of the pot and then what you want to try to get out of the harvest. So fewer potatoes in the pot will get you larger potatoes. If you put more potatoes in the pot, you're going to get smaller potatoes overall, but you might get more of them. Tip number 5, which is about mulching. After you have the potatoes planted, you're going to wait for them to sprout, and once you get about 3 inches or so of growth, it's a good idea to mulch the tops of the pot. And we mulched with just grass clippings. There's a couple of reasons to do this. One, it helps to retain moisture, so you're watering less often. And 2, it also acts as a light blocker, because you don't want sunlight getting to any potatoes that happen to form near maybe the surface of the top. Sunlight causes a reaction in the potatoes and they turn green, and that green actually is toxic and you can't eat those potatoes. Tip number 6 is how to deal with things that might go wrong. And specifically, I'm talking about pests and diseases. So there's a few critters that you have to be on the lookout for: potato bugs, hornworm caterpillars, aphids, and slugs. All right, so how to get rid of them? The best thing to do is just try to physically remove them. You can also use an organic insecticidal soap, and that's the kind of thing you can just spray on the leaves, and it's going to discourage or inhibit those critters from infesting the leaves. All of those pests you can see on the leaves. One of the pests that's in the ground are wireworm, and we've got a lot of wireworms in our soil, and what they'll do is they'll burrow into your potatoes and they can ruin crops of potatoes. We've actually lost a lot of potatoes in the past to wireworm. And so that is why we're growing them in pots, and the pots are elevated off the ground. So the wireworms, which are in the soil, aren't going to get into our potato pots. Now that's all about pests. The next thing to consider are diseases like blight, and this can affect the foliage and cause dieback. And there are 2 ways to help prevent this. are to avoid getting water on the leaves. So when you're watering, you want to water at the surface. Also, try to make sure there's enough air circulation around the potatoes. And the other thing you can do is when you're looking for seed potatoes, look for ones that are specifically bred to be resistant to diseases like blight. Tip number 7 is about watering and fertilizing. So you don't want to overwater potatoes, particularly if you're doing this in pots, which is why the drainage in tip number 1 is so important. You don't want them to be overwatered because that's going to encourage rot. And you want to make sure that you are watering them from the surface. Again, like I mentioned before, you want to try to keep the water off of the leaves. For fertilizer, we like to use an organic liquid seaweed, and we like to do that about once a month. Tip number 8 is about the flowers. Do you remove them or do you leave them? If the potatoes are flowering, that means they're channeling more energy into producing those flowers and less energy into producing more potatoes for you that you want to eat. So if you want to encourage more of that energy to stay with growing potatoes, you can remove the flowers. At the same time, if you want to, you can simply leave the flowers. The flowers have a nice fragrance and the pollinators like them as well. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, just depending on what you want. Tip number 9, when to harvest. So how do you know when it's time to harvest the potatoes? What you're looking for is for the foliage to die back. And once the foliage dies back, you want to wait about a week to 10 days before harvesting. That gives an opportunity for the skins of the potatoes to kind of cure or harden up, and that's going to make the potatoes store much better. To harvest the potatoes, all we have to do is just dump them out on a tarp or into the wheelbarrow and go through the soil and pick out the potatoes. So we've gone from getting our containers ready all the way up through harvesting our potatoes. Tip number 10 is, what do I do with all the soil from these containers? There's a couple of things you can do. You can take the old soil and put it on the compost. You can use it to mulch flower beds or that sort of thing. As long as there weren't any diseases on your potatoes, you didn't have wireworm or anything like that, you can reuse the soil. You want to make sure that it's dried out and you store it in a cool, dry place. And then the next season, you want to recharge it with compost and add fertilizer, and then you're good to go. And if you're at all worried about the soil, just don't use it on anything that's in the potato, tomato, pepper family, and that should also be fine. Growing potatoes in pots has been a real game changer for us. It's easier to plant them out, saves us space in the garden to use for other crops, and it's a lot easier to harvest the potatoes without having to dig them up out of the ground at the end of the season. So if you have any questions about growing potatoes, leave them down in the comments and I will be happy to answer and help out. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Hi, it's Dan from the Frog Pond Veg Patch. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. That'll help us create new content to share with you. And while you're here, check out this next video I have lined up for you. And don't forget to like and subscribe. That's the best way to help us out on this channel.